Which you were certainly overly generous. Thank you very much. And thank you so much, Anne, for joining us today. You can realize we have here a woman who is doing it all at the highest level. She's advising candidates. She's working on research. She's working in legal aid. She has 2 relatively young children. She has a fully employed husband. She is basically juggling everything, and so she can help us think about that today, both in terms of professional women, but in terms of all women. And I thought, I was struck by, I read some of Anne's work, and there are some amazing statistics at the beginning of a study I recommend to you by the Center for American Progress, another place that Anne and I both have some engagement with in Washington. It's basically just a state of working America. But there are some amazing facts which I think can set the context for our discussion and that you all can keep in mind as you go forward. These are facts that when I raise them occasionally, particularly in settings which are mostly men, people look at me in complete disbelief. They don't believe the number. They want to go on Facebook or they want to go on Google to check the number. So here are some numbers. They believe this number. Women make up half of all of the workers in the United States. So we've passed that threshold. More than half of all workers in the United States are women. Mothers are now the primary breadwinners, making as much or more than their spouses in 40% of families. 40%. So working mothers. Two-thirds of all mothers are breadwinners or co-breadwinners for bringing in about a quarter of family income. So the importance of mothers, families, family-work balance in this kind of world is just, you can't underestimate the importance of this and what to do about it as a society. Not only has the workforce changed, and these are just my final facts, but family structures have also been changing. So in 1975, that was the year women in the United States started entering the labor force in large numbers. That's the year I entered the labor force. Okay, so I'm a baby boomer. I'm sort of, I always sort of end up being in these kind of, so 1975. In that year, nearly half of all families in the United States consisted of a male breadwinner and a female homemaker. That was the expectation that I was working against. That was the expectation of all the people around me. And nearly half of all families had that. You might say only half, but it was half. Now it's only 20%. 20% of families have that structure. Other families have different structures. In 1975, single-parent households made up basically only 10% of all families. And now that figure has doubled. So single-family households make up 20% of all families. Now here are some related statistics about that. 41% of all births in the United States are to unmarried women. For women under 30, half of all births are to single women. Half. That's a number that people don't really believe. That was when I saw a colleague of mine sitting there looking up because he didn't believe it. Why does this matter? Well, to some extent it matters because there's a strong correlation between poverty and growing up in a single family household, particularly if that household is headed by a woman. So again, these are my last 2 numbers. I promise you this. The poverty rate for children in a household headed by a female, 46%. That is compared to an overall poverty rate of children of 10% in families. And then if you go to children under 6, the percentage of children under 6 in a single family household headed by a woman, the poverty rate there is more than half. Poverty in childhood matters. It matters to learning, and this is how I'm going to first turn to Anne, because Anne does a variety of things on work, family. One of the things she's working on right now is Too Small to Fail, and what we do with children aged 0 to 5, particularly these children who are being raised in poverty, under 6, 55%. What do we do? And Anne has devoted her time and her energy to coming up with policy. So maybe, Anne, let's just start with this notion of what happens to these children and how we can support families to support those children.
Great. Well, first, thank you so much for inviting me here. It's a real honor to be sitting here with Laura. So I graduated from college in 1993, and when I did, I spent a year in Washington working for a labor union, and then got invited to be a very young member of the Clinton White House. And it was a time in which Clinton was doing a great job in making sure that there were more women than ever before in terms of senior leadership. But I remember, I was a very young person, and remember Laura's leadership in the White House. We did not know each other because she was so busy she didn't know the likes of the young women like me, but she certainly was so inspirational to many of us. So it's really quite an honor for me to be here having this conversation with Laura. So let me say a little bit about your question, in particular some of the statistics that you mentioned. I think that it's incredibly important that people understand this issue of women's labor force participation. I know at today's conference you're going to talk a lot about professional women and how we make sure that we stay in the game and that we're leading the effort. There's a lot of research to show that women lead. It really does help all women because we have more policies in place for child care, for paid maternity leave, for paid family leave. When the work I'm doing right now in terms of the question you asked me about 0 to 5 is really looking at how do we support families in our country, because we know how important these critical early years are. We know more than ever before about brain science and about early brain development, and we know that in these very early years that a child's brain is developing so fast, and that the adults in that child's life have such an important role to play in literally growing the baby's brain. So when you talk to a young baby, when you engage them in conversation, the back and forth of babbling with them, you're literally helping their brain synapses form. And when that doesn't happen, babies' brains are literally not making those synapses and have lifelong consequences in terms of their health and their ability to learn. And I think that's something that's really quite new to people to understand that. So what we're trying to do is to both empower parents and caregivers to understand this research, but also to have the ability to do this work. So one of the, just on the early childhood piece, to understand the impact between work and early childhood development. By the time a child is 4 years old, if a child comes from a high-income family in which there's both language-rich parenting and there's access to great quality child care, so when you're at work, your child is being cared for somebody who's doing all these great language-rich parenting, we know that those children have actually heard about 30 million more words than children who are from lower-income families and who are not getting talked to. And those words that they're hearing directly translate into their building of their vocabulary. So by that time, by the age of only 4, children from these language-rich environments have more than double the vocabulary of their peers who haven't been in those environments. By the time they get to school, the school readiness gap is already so large that it has a hard time closing. There's a researcher from Stanford named Sean Reardon who has showed that the achievement gap that you start with in kindergarten only closes by about 10% in all of K through 12. So I contextualize that because it makes it even more important that we have protections in place like paid family leave and paid sick days, but we also have access to quality child care and universal preschool, because it's not only about women's labor force participation, which it is because that's so critical to the family income, but it's also about how are we making sure that when women and men participate in the labor force, that we have policies in place to support children. And we are very far behind in this country on that, which I know we'll talk about today.
Right. So, yes, it's really quite shocking to look at comparisons of the U.S. and other developed countries, and clearly the U.S. is at the bottom in terms of all of a set of policies which we can talk about of how you support the family and therefore how you support the women and children in the family. So starting with I know something you've been working on a lot, and this is basically, we don't have in this country paid sick leave. We do not have that. It was a big breakthrough and politically controversial at the beginning of the Clinton administration to get the notion of unpaid sick leave as a right to ask for unpaid sick leave. So tell us a little bit about your work in this area. We've been talking beforehand. We live in California. California is big enough to be a country. And California is actually, in this area, as in many areas, in the leading edge here. So maybe you could talk a little bit about the importance of the sick leave dimension of all of this and what California is doing and what we should be doing nationally.
Great. So California has been long on the cutting edge of this story. So let me just give a very brief history. So there's a couple of things we don't have in the United States. We don't offer paid maternity leave. We don't offer paid parental leave for men and women. So paid family caregiving. We don't have paid medical leave. We don't have employers don't have paid sick days. So there's lots of things we don't have. So one of the things, however, that's really interesting is if you look at the structure. So I'm a lawyer by training, and if you look at how our laws have developed, basically there was the women's movement in the 1960s was a real push for women's equity. Let's make sure that when women go to the workforce, they're at least able to get the same benefits and rights as men. So everybody knows that Title VII is the anti-discrimination law, saying that you can't discriminate on the basis of race or sex. In 1978, there was a very seminal moment when the Supreme Court had come down with a couple of rulings that basically said, well, discriminating on the basis of sex doesn't mean you can't discriminate on the basis of pregnancy, because there's both pregnant people and non-pregnant people, but that's not related to men and women. So that was an interesting case. So we then fast forward, and in 1978, Congress says, wait a second, let's pass the Pregnancy Discrimination Act that says pregnancy is in fact a part of the basis of sex, and so you cannot be discriminated against if you're pregnant, if you're childbearing. So what that meant is that in 1978, when the Pregnancy Discrimination Act passed, it meant that if you were working for an employer that offered paid sick days, that offered short-term disability insurance, so if you're a guy and you had a heart attack and you got disability insurance, it meant that you then, as a pregnant woman, would have access to those same policies. So if I needed to be out because I was having complications with my pregnancy, I was actually having the baby, or I was recovering from the physical recovery from childbirth, I would get access to that. So what's quite fascinating is actually for women who were, kind of sitting in these chairs in 1978, what it meant is that suddenly you actually did often get access to paid maternity leave in your workplace through these policies because employers had them. So there's this terrific chart that the census puts out that shows who has access to paid maternity leave in the country. And it shows in the 1960s that actually women with less than a high school degree, about 18% had access to paid maternity leave, but only 14% of professional women with college degrees or higher. Now that was because many lower wage workers were still part of unions, and there was collective bargaining agreements where they were bargaining for that. You then look at the chart, and after 1968, there's this huge bump up. So more than 50% of professional women, college degrees or greater, have access to paid maternity leave, but still only 18% of low-wage workers. You then have a bump up, and in 1992, when the Family and Medical Leave Act passed, and we provided both unpaid leave for both men and women, and also many companies started extending it, we now have over 60% of professional women with college degrees or greater, have access to paid maternity leave, but still today, only 18% of low-wage workers. So it's really quite staggering that we've had this change. So 1992 comes in. President Clinton actually, on the campaign trail, advocates for a Family and Medical Leave Act. The first President Bush had actually vetoed it twice. I think it ended up being a big mistake because politically people thought this was crazy. So it was literally the first act first law that President Clinton signed in, the Family and Medical Leave Act. And what that does is it says that you can take 12 weeks off, unpaid leave, but you don't get fired, and you get your job back, which was huge at the time. It still is huge for many people. It can be taken for paid parental leave. It can be taken for caring for a sick sick relative, or it can be taken for your own serious illness. So it's a 12-week period. About 60% of the workforce is covered by the Family and Medical Leave Act. The reason not more covered is that there's some thresholds. You have to work for an employer that's 50 employees or more. You also have to have an attachment to the workforce. You have to be working for the same employer for a year for a certain amount of hours. So we still have a ways to go. What happened, however, is after that is that states like California, which actually in the 1940s and 50s, there were 5 states that said, we need to make sure that we actually provide short-term disability insurance. So we know that we have a system in place where if you get get injured on the job, you get workers' comp. But what if you get hit by a bus, or you get cancer, or you get a heart attack? We don't have wage replacement during that time. So 5 states, including California, had passed these short-term disability insurance programs. And then in 1978, pregnant women were covered by those programs. We went further in California, and just over 10 years ago, in 2002, it was actually implemented in 2004. We were the first state in the nation to pass paid family leave in California. And so this has been a terrific opportunity for individuals. So now women who give birth get the disability insurance from pregnancy for 6 weeks, and then both men and women can take an additional 6 weeks off for paid family leave. So the great news is that this has really helped a number of women in California. There's a researcher at Columbia, Jane Waldfogel, who showed that the people who most benefited were actually low-wage workers, because they literally had no access to paid family leave, so it more than doubled their opportunities to take this. But it also helped many middle earners and higher earners as well. And one of the things that's really quite fascinating is that men ended up taking advantage of this, and we actually have a much higher percentage than in other states of men taking paid family leave. So it's been a great effort, but there's only 3 states in the country who do this now. It's California, New Jersey, and Rhode Island. So there's a big push in Congress to try to see whether or not we could actually pass paid family and medical leave at the national level, and I think that will be an interesting conversation. And then the other issue, just really quickly, is that many people don't even have access to short-term paid sick days. Right. So what if my child gets the flu? I don't actually qualify for FMLA because you have to have a serious illness. But getting the flu, if you have no job protection and you can't, literally have to decide, am I going to stay at home and take care of my child with the flu, or if am I going to go to work? The answer is that you're going to stay at home, and you're probably going to either get fired or docked for pay if it happens more than once. And anybody who's been dealing with this horrible flu season, as my family has in 2015, I literally at one point tweeted out, I would be so fired right now if I was a low-wage worker, given how many times I have had to take time off for either for my own illness or my child's sickness. So in California, again, became one of the first states in the nation. Just last year, we passed paid sick days. So in California now, you get a minimum of 3 paid sick days. So it doesn't sound like a lot, but it's better. It's a good start. It covered 6.5 million people who did not previously have access to any paid sick days. So it really is quite a start to where we need to go.
So could I ask a question? Let's think about this from the point of view of opponents to it, why it's been so hard to get this. And as you mentioned, we also have in almost all these laws a pretty big exemption for small companies. So one of the things you hear all the time is all net new jobs are created by small companies, and they're the employment generation for the future, and we all applaud small companies. Small companies are largely left out of this, in part because their argument is they can't afford it. They can't do it, it's not possible. So talk a little bit about the opposition and the evidence. Why is it a cost problem? What are the benefits to the employer from doing this? If we impose it at the national level in terms of policy, what does that do to labor costs?
Right. So, California, again, on the cutting edge, both our paid family leave and our paid sick days actually covers any employer that has 5 or more employees. So it's really quite broad.
Oh, that one's broad.
But the very unfortunate thing is we have 2 different ways that we're helping workers. One is the paid leave. And just to give you a sense, is that paid family medical leave is what we call a social insurance program. So basically what it means is it's a payroll tax. We're all paying into it, and we pay into the bucket. The government sets up a social insurance system, and then when you need it, you're able to apply to the California state government to get this insurance for yourself for the wage replacement. So the employer isn't actually providing the paid family and medical leave, the longer term paid, the six weeks of family leave itself. But the reason employers have a hard time with it is even though they're not paying it, it's 100% payroll tax paid by the worker, they're not paying into it, but they worry so much, particularly small businesses, about having a worker out for that amount of time in terms of getting the work done. So the problem is that in California, we don't actually provide job protection, so you don't actually have the right to take it if you work for an employer with 50 or under. So you're paying into the system, but your employer might say, I'm sorry, I can't afford to lose you. So even though you could actually apply for the state to get the social insurance, you might not be able to take it. So it's something we're trying to deal with, and it is the thing that the Chamber of Commerce and the business community most worries about, which is, fine if you want to set up the social insurance program, but having a worker out for 6 or 12 weeks when I only have 5 employees is very stressful. And I've run nonprofits over a number of years, and it is very stressful. It's very challenging. And so we're trying to think about, are there policy solutions we can put in place that provide some type of tax incentives to employers or some type of money that they could use to provide temporary help while they need it. But it is a real issue. One of the things, however, that we have found in research that's been done on California is that overwhelmingly employers have said that this really has not cost my bottom line at all. In fact, some employers have said this has helped me because I was already providing paid family and medical leave, and now actually the state's providing 6 weeks of it, and I only have to top it up. So there is, a mix. Actually, the Chamber of Commerce now actually in California goes around the state encouraging employers to raise awareness about paid family and medical leave because they want workers to take advantage of it. So the Chamber of Commerce has changed on that. The paid sick days, however, is even more opposed by the business community. And the reason for that is it's an employer mandate, which says it's requiring not the government to pay this out of a payroll tax, but it's requiring the employer to offer the paid sick days and to pay the paid sick days. So the business community said, wow, that's really going to cost a lot of money. Not only do I have to have the worker out, but I'm responsible for paying that. So, I think that California is the test case in California, which is that we just started paid sick days requirement this year. So there's going to be research done. We're going to really have to make the business case. I think if we're going to get this in other states and nationally, we're going to have to show that it has not hurt the bottom line, and in fact, it's helped. And there was some very good research coming out of business schools showing that, employee retention goes way up, productivity of employees goes way up, because the fact of the matter is that workers, when they know their job is there, they're less stressed, they're more productive, and you don't have to retrain someone. So we feel like that is we're going to prove that case, but there's still work to do.
So great research opportunities here at the business school. I think we should definitely be connected to this.
That's a great idea.
It's really important research about talent, because we talk so much at business schools about talent development, talent retention, the cost of that, the engagement of the workers, and if the evidence, and I've seen some of this evidence, is suggesting that you actually get great benefits from doing this, and I think that's very important. We've got to make the case.
Yeah, exactly.
So related to this is also the issue that you've been most in the news about lately. Well, you've been in the news about the too small to fail, but also the flexible and unpredictable schedule. So people love the new technology. They love the new technology which creates on-demand work. They love the idea that, there's flexibility. You basically can do something for 3 hours and then have the flexibility to do it this week for 3 hours and next week for 10 hours and next week for no hours. That's the sort of plus side of the flexibility of the Uber driver story as the kind of quintessential story here. But there's also the issue of you are in one of these families, maybe you're the single earner, you are trying to put together a family income by doing a number of jobs. And your schedule is completely not under your control. So you don't know how many hours you're going to be asked to work. So you've been working on this, which I think is very cutting edge because we're moving in this direction. So tell us a little bit about that issue.
Yeah, so this is an idea that's been kind of brewing for some time. So I think there's been a conversation in this country and in rooms like this about workplace flexibility largely for professional women, and I certainly am one who needs it. I know many of us do, where you think, I can do my job. It's not a problem. I'll do it at 2 o'clock in the morning if I need to. I'll get the job done. But there are some days in which, when I was on the phone prepping for this conference, I had a babysitter break down. I had 2 kids in the back. and I was talking on the phone. So we all have days like that. And so there's an issue of how do we make sure that we actually have the right to request flexibility. So the UK, Australia, New Zealand had made a big push in a number of years ago now, about 10 years ago. They had pushed laws called right to request flexibility, which is that it really helped a number of different workers, particularly women, as we all know from the research. I know you're going to talk about at your conference today, the asking for benefits is sometimes more challenging for women who feel disempowered. And so the right to request flexibility was you can go into your employer, there's going to be a process in place where you can ask for a flexible work schedule, and your employer has to engage in conversation with you and decide. The employer ultimately gets to decide whether or not that works. But what we've seen is that there's been a huge increase in granting of flexible schedules. You can't get fired for asking, and your employer has to really consider it. So there was a supervisor in San Francisco named David Chu, who's now in the state assembly. He was actually the president of the board of supervisors, and he called up a couple of years ago and said, I'm really interested in this flexibility issue because in San Francisco we're losing families, and professional families are going to the suburbs, and we want to encourage them to stay here. What about doing this right to request flexibility? So I said, terrific, let's do it. But let's think about, and I love the name of your conference, Empower Me, Invest in All. So let's think about how do we empower women to have the right to request flexibility, but let's look at both what women need on the professional side and on the low-wage side. Many low-wage workers don't need flexibility, they need predictability. They need to know when they're working and how many hours they're working, and they need to have a fair schedule. So we decided what we'd do is we'd actually allow it so that you could request either flexibility or predictability. We started there, but we then recognized that there was a lot more work to do in this area. So there's basically a confluence of three things happening. Technology has meant that big companies are doing what they call just-in-time scheduling. So basically using software to look at the data. So let's take a Starbucks or a Walmart. I always like to use I call them the blue and red companies. So both companies are doing this. They basically are looking at, when someone coming in to buy coffee or when are they coming to Walmart to buy their groceries or their clothes, and they then are making a determination about how many workers they need to have working. And so what it has meant is that workers who used to get schedules 2 weeks, 3 weeks, a month in advance were literally getting schedule changes less than a week in advance. So what we're seeing is that we have a huge increase. Actually, California has the highest number of hourly workers in the United States. We've got about 8.9 million people in California work on an hourly basis. We also have had actually the greatest increase in involuntary part-time workers, so people who want to be working full-time but actually are working full-time has increased threefold since 2007, since the Great Recession. So you've got this technology place in place, you've got more hourly workers than ever, you've got people working part-time, and the fact of the matter is that oftentimes workers are combining a couple of different things. They're often combining work with parenting or caregiving, or they're combining work with going to school. I know you guys have a part-time MBA program. There's many people who are going to community college, for example, and trying to work to further their careers. And we also have people who are working multiple part-time jobs because of this rise in involuntary part-time. So what we said is let's do more in predictability. So we actually set up a predictability task force in San Francisco between labor advocates and businesses and try to come to the table around a couple of ideas. So we ended up and passed the first in the nation ordinance here in San Francisco requiring that large employers in San Francisco provide 2 weeks advance notice to people's schedules, that if they change the schedule within a week, they would have to pay a penalty. The employer would have to pay a penalty. And if they change it within 24 hours, the penalty would go up. So we just have started, that law literally just passed at the end of last year, just being implemented this year. But David Chu has now gone on to the state assembly, and we're now working on a bill statewide on predictable schedules. Now, this is one the Chamber of Commerce really hates. And so, the good news is that because they hate it so much, employers are actually stepping up. So you probably read about Walmart making a very big deal and putting $1 billion in to increase the wages of their low-wage workers, which is terrific. But which got less news is they also made a big play on predictable scheduling. They said, we're going to make sure that we do a lot more on predictability. And so that's a big news. Starbucks actually had this horrible article on the front page of the New York Times about a barista who was trying to deal with this. And then the CEO of Starbucks stood up and said, wait a second, we didn't know this was this bad. We're going to provide 2 weeks advance. So there are some employers, large employers, who are stepping forward and say, we're going to do this on our own. But we are in California trying to test out whether or not we should legislate in this area and what it looks like. And so I think there's a lot to learn.
Mm-hmm. So one of the things that brings together the part of the economy that, say, Janet Yellen works on, and the part of the economy that you work on, is as labor markets have begun to become tighter, then a company like Walmart is more likely to say, okay, I really need to attract and retain a larger fraction of my workforce. Therefore, what is it I can do? I can raise their wage, I can give them a more predictable schedule, because I really need them. The demand for labor is a very simple concept here, and as the labor markets are now really just showing signs of tightening, which the best indicator of tightening is wage increases, honestly.
Yeah, exactly.
And so we're just beginning to see that. And Janet Yellen is kind of looking at this, and it's really interesting to go back to that. And she's saying, you know, when do I believe the labor market is tight enough that there's some risk of inflation, and therefore I should change monetary policy? One of the things that they are looking at all the time is wages. So it will be very interesting to see how this plays out.
And just on Janet Yellen, you know, I think it's fascinating that she has made a big play on really trying to contextualize this. So you may have seen, and if you haven't, we should make sure everybody at this conference reads her speech that she gave at Inequality in Boston a couple of months ago.
It was great.
But it was just terrific, and it was so unusual that you'd have a chair of the Federal Reserve giving this speech, and she was contextualizing it and tying this together, which is we have to look at our human capital throughout the labor market. We've got to think about, and she made a big play on early childhood education and on investing in K through 12. So I think that we have somebody at the helm right now who really understands how we tie together, our fiscal policy, our labor market policy with some of these big issues with regard to human capital investment in the labor market.
I think it goes to the point of having more women at the heads of state, at the heads of major organizations, because not only was that a first in terms of a Federal Reserve chair speech dealing with inequality and talking about early childhood education, but if you go, say, to the International Monetary Fund and you read the speeches of Christine Lagarde, or you look at the fact that under Christine Lagarde's leadership of the International Monetary Fund, for the first time ever, in an analysis of policy for a country, this was the country of Japan, she talked about the importance of policies to support and promote women as a key to Japan's economic growth strategy.
Right.
Never ever happened before in a major engagement of the IMF with a country.
Yes.
So these things really do matter, and it's wonderful to have you at the helm of so many things, because you can really move this forward because you have a passionate engagement with it and you understand it, and we've got to bring it to the attention of companies as you do, or policymakers as you do. Let me turn to the technology a little bit, because there's a huge debate raging now at this point about on-demand, the pros and cons of on-demand technologies for workers. Is it going to destroy jobs and eliminate jobs? Is it going to take away workers' rights? Is it going to lead to a whole bunch of highly commoditized or low-wage jobs? And then you have the people who say, no, this is the future. The future is all the wonderful ways you can match the job with the person, with the skill, with the hour, through technology. It's brilliant matching technology. It brings down the transactions cost of on-demand. So I think my guess is it's probably too early to think about this, but on the other hand, you come out of a tradition which is really important here, and that is the use of law and the use of some organizations to bargain for workers in terms of their needs. And what's your view right now of the technology and how we need to change our policy outlooks based on what we think the technology is going to do to the workforce and jobs in the next, say, decade?
Yeah, so I think it's a fascinating time, and I think, none of us who do this work really know how this is going to play out. But I think there's some interesting indicators. So you remember when Marissa Mayer became the head of Yahoo, one of the first things she did, which was really quite controversial, is she said, no more working at home. I want to call everybody back into the office. Now, that was very interesting for a technology company to basically say, this isn't working out for us. Now, some people said, well, there was a undercurrent story there that they hadn't figured out how to effectively monitor the people who were working at home. They had a lot of people who weren't effective, and they wanted to call them in so they could figure out who was doing a good job. But the fact of the matter is that they still have that policy in place. They have a much tighter rules now about working, actually having the FaceTime at Yahoo. So I thought that was a fascinating, kind of in some sense indictment on technology, that it doesn't work if there's not this ability to have some human connection. So I think that there's that question of like, how are we actually interacting with each other? But then on the larger question of, if you think about, the work that I do with regard to low-wage workers and others, is that a lot of this work had been for, many years governed by labor unions. Right now, only 6% of private sector workers are actually in a labor union. 6%, lowest ever. And so you think that we have a lot of work to do to think about what are the collective voices to ensure that we actually are able to negotiate. So I think the Walmart example is a fascinating example. Walmart was under extreme pressure by the labor movement. The United Food and Commercial Workers, while they have no one's ever been able to successfully, and I don't think anyone ever will successfully organize within Walmart, they recognized that they could have a tremendous voice because of technology, because they can go on Facebook and Twitter and they can do social media organizing. They were hammering Walmart left and right everywhere they went. And so Walmart recognized that if they didn't do this, that in the court of public opinion, they were really losing. And so there are different ways in which I think technology is being used to organize, which is really quite fascinating. But then there's the questions of, what does this mean for individual workers, so that whether it's the Uber. So my general policy, and I very highly recommend this, is anytime, I use Uber all the time. Anytime I get into an Uber car, I ask them all about their lives. What do you do? How'd you get here? What's happening? So I'm conducting my own experiment. And we have to share data on this at some point. So it is fascinating what's out there. I had a mom who worked at Target and then was doing this on the side. You get the guy who's a small business owner is trying to help. Then there's the person who used to be a cabbie, and the cabbies are all mad, and he's now driving Uber. So, I think that there's going to be a lot to learn in this. I mean, obviously on the legal regulatory issue, none of us can figure out how to deal with it. But right. I think on the worker issue, it is just a really uncharted territory that we're all still trying to figure out.
Okay, so this should be a very big question, I think, for Haas and business schools going forward. This is really, I think, there's really no debate about the transformational nature of the technology. The only debate is about the speed and whether we can come up with regulatory, legal, policy, personal responses to it, because it's moving so fast. I know that we talked with Olivia and Carmela about ending our conversation part of this by talking a little bit about our own personal histories. And in order to make that relevant to the audience, I just wanted to point out a very interesting recent survey that was done and reported in Harvard Business Review in December of 2014. So they asked men and women across generations, from my generation, baby boomers, to Gen X's, all the way to millennials. They asked men and women who were graduating from business school. So the questions were about, do you have the same ambition for professional success? Because there's been, over the years, many times there have been articles or books suggesting that men and women have different levels of ambition, aspiration. This survey says nonsense. If you have the same educated, same skills, same sort of a basic sort of launch pad, business school, say, do you have the same aspirations? Yes, men and women have the same aspirations. Okay. So then, where do things start to differ? they start to differ in terms of expectations about which career in a family is more important. Which career is more important? So here, majority of men expect their career to be more important. That's it. That's not true of the majority of women. So men and women are getting married. They're setting up families. Maybe they're not getting married. They're setting up families, partnerships, where the expectations of the male and the female are not the same in terms of priorities for professional advancement. Whose career counts? The differences are even greater in terms of child care responsibilities, even greater. So to this day, now it's bigger, the difference is bigger for baby boomers, my generation, but you still see it in millennials. The expectation of the majority of men is that the primary responsibility for child care will be with their spouse. And that's not the primary expectation for women. So clearly there's going to have to be some negotiation. So remember also, Sheryl Sandberg, we all know the words that describe what she talks about, lean in. Now I would say, you're going to talk a lot about leaning in today. It's empowerment, personal empowerment. We've been talking about how society should be leaning in to help men and women and their children so that it doesn't all fall on the person to lean in. Society should lean in here, and we're not leaning in. But the other thing Sheryl says in her book is, choose the right spouse. That is what she says. Okay? This is equal weight. This is equal weight. In her analysis is equal weight. So I think we should talk a little bit about how we've managed this. Our spouses were both invited to this and both had other
My husband is at gymnastics with our 2 children.
My husband has no real excuse. He just, But let's talk a little bit about the importance of, in your career, how you've handled work-life balance issues and professional aspirations issues in terms of your relationship with your spouse.
So I'll first start with the academic and then the personal. So there's a terrific book called Getting to 50-50. It's written by a woman named Sharon Mears, who I think may be a Haas alum, but I'm not totally positive about that. But she's a senior person at eBay. She's one of the most senior people at eBay. And she wrote this book called Getting to 50-50. And it's all about the fact that, for professional women, we actually already have paid sick days and paid maternity leave. We've got flexibility. We've got predictability. We kind of have a lot of stuff that we're fighting for our, low-wage sisters to get. But what we don't have often are these different expectations about home. The hardest part for us is actually negotiating on the home front, is that there's really differences. And so getting to 50-50 is all about getting to 50-50 in the home and the work, which is that you cannot get to 50-50 in the workplace if you're not at 50-50 in the home. So I was lucky. I didn't know Sheryl Sandberg's advice at the time, but I luckily picked a great spouse. My husband his parents immigrated from Taiwan. They both came here in the 1960s, and they're both doctors. And I mention that because my husband grew up seeing both of his parents work, but it was also a very traditional family. And his mom worked twice as hard as his dad because his dad literally did not do any of the cooking or the helping with the kids. And he was, felt like it was unfair to his mom, to be honest, and said, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to do that to my spouse or my kids. I'm really going to participate. And it was really important to him to be a full participant in the family. And so from the very beginning, this is something that he took seriously. We met working in Washington, D.C., doing policy work in the Clinton administration. And he's from California, and so got an opportunity to teach here at UC Berkeley. And the whole idea was, I was at the time working as Hillary Clinton's legislative director, so at a pretty senior position for, I was 30 years old and having a great time in DC. And it was a hard thing for me to give that up and to come to California, to be totally honest. And so I said, okay, well, we'll stay for 5 years. You get tenure, but we're going back to the East Coast. And so in 2007, February 2007, I got a phone call. Hillary Clinton was going to run for president, come back, be part of the policy team, and I was 8 months pregnant. And I said, okay, great, well, have the baby, and then we'll move back to D.C. And Goodwin was like, well, wait a second here. This is really unrealistic. Why don't we wait till she makes it to the general? At least the baby will be like 6 months old. So I said, okay, we'll wait till general. Well, she actually didn't win that primary, as you guys all know. But it's been a kind of continual negotiation and pull between my work on the East Coast and my work, my husband really based here. He then got appointed by Governor Brown to be on the California Supreme Court. So what I would say, however, is that my husband has been, throughout this whole thing, very much a lean-in advocate, which is every opportunity that I have, he wants me to lean into. So I have, for the last 6 months, been a policy advisor to well, she hasn't announced yet, but you might have heard Hillary's thinking about running for president. Yeah. So I've been, for the last 6 months, flying back and forth to New York and helping this route. And my husband, very much has been, doing everything he always does, but even more. And I would say that, one of the things that I think we have to change is my husband's often frustrated. He literally packs the lunches every single day. He's the person responsible. He does all the groceries. I do not cook. He does everything in our house with regard to cooking. And so he, sometimes feels that people don't understand him. They don't understand. They say things like, "Oh, are you babysitting today?" I'm like, "No, I'm taking care of my children." And so there's some expectation there in terms of changes. There's also when he joined the California Supreme Court, he was younger by about 20 years than anybody else on the court. So there was a lot of differences in terms of expectations. And I remember when he first got appointed, I said, "Okay, well, at least on the weeks that you're sitting, I'm going to make sure that I don't travel on those weeks because it'd be really hard." And then literally the second month, I got invited to be part of a delegation, to be a part of the United States delegation to go to China and to present on work-family, ironically, to present on work-family issues. And it was the same week that he was sitting. So I said, "Oh my God, I really want to do this." And he said, "Okay, well, we'll just make it happen." But his mom, who usually backs us up, wasn't available that week. And so I was like, "What are we going to do?" And he said, I'm just going to have to tell my colleagues. So he was sitting on the bench, and he had to leave by 4:30 in order to get back over here to the Berkeley-Oakland area and pick both kids up. And so he said to his colleagues, "I'm so sorry. My wife's in China. She's part of this delegation. I'm gonna have to go off." And so some of the older members of the court said, "Oh, isn't that sweet? You're taking care of the kids this week." And he was kind of like, "No, I take care of the kids every week. It's just this is unusual circumstance." So I would say that we are in it. This is hard work. There's not that many of us who are professionally 100% leaning in and trying to do it. We have, I will say, hired more help, which I highly recommend once you're able to do that. But you still want to be a parent. You want to be there and put your kids to bed. You want to be part of their lives. You want to go to their events at school. And it's just a lot of negotiating and juggling, but you need two people to do it if you can.
So I will only add to that in one respect. I'm happy to tell my personal story, but I would rather have time for you guys. But I always point out that I'm a very good friend of Bob Reich, and Bob Reich and I were in government at the same time, and our families were friends, and we had children of the same age who were still friends. And at the end of the first term in office, Bob and I loved our jobs. We loved our jobs. And there was absolute certainty we could stay and do those jobs or do other jobs. And frankly, our family said to us, "These are family jobs, and we're done with these jobs. We're finished with these jobs because these jobs demand too much of the family. There's too little of you to be there." And Bob and I both left. We left. And I think one of the things I say to that is that it's a constant throughout your life. It's a constant balancing act. It doesn't go away. There's no silver bullet solution. I heard Ruth Bader Ginsburg recently talk about this, and she said, "Well, for a while in my life, I just devoted myself entirely to my husband becoming partner at the law firm he wanted to become partner at. And that was totally his, and I did everything to make that possible." And she said, and then unfortunately for him, he's had a much longer time in our relationship doing the same for me, basically. So it's balancing across a lifetime. It's balancing every day. So when you were on the phone with the two kids in the back, it's balancing every day. And sometimes it gets out of balance. It's not perfect. But when you have an understanding and committed spouse, then he or she, your partner, can work with you on the incredible challenge of getting the balance right, which is it's just a hard task. Okay, first of all, let's thank Anne for sharing so much of this. Or so, we have a couple of questions. So we have some mics and some questions.
There's one over here.
Right here in the front.
Thank you, Anne, for sharing all your stories. My question is around, you're passing all these wonderful laws to protect the low-wage workers, but how does California ensure that these laws are actually getting enforced? And how can we ask our employers for like paid family leave, and when we how do you make sure that it's enforced?
How do you make sure it's enforced? I see. That's a really great question, and I think it's, we actually have a woman in California named Julie Sue, who is a terrific lawyer, and she's the head of labor enforcement for the state of California. And it is going to be a big issue, particularly on paid sick days, to enforce that. We have a terrific labor enforcement mechanism in San Francisco, also headed by a terrific woman. So there's government agencies that do this, but a lot of it is cultural and public awareness. So one of the things that we've had, even though we've had in California 10 years now paid family leave, we have a very low awareness rate. I mean, many people I talk to have no idea that California actually has paid family leave, and people don't know how to access it, so they don't know about it. So part of it is making sure that we raise awareness about it, in addition to making sure that employers follow the book and that we enforce it. And I think we have work to do on both of those fronts. Mm-hmm.
Hi. You were talking about Hillary running for president. This is an idea that I think we've all been thinking a lot about. And it seems to me that she's almost waiting in a way because she needs a groundswell of support to almost force her to run rather than stepping up and saying, I'm going to run. And I'm wondering, as a woman, do you think society's looking at her differently as running, and she's probably adjusting her behavior accordingly?
No, I'll tell you why she's not yet running.
We have an insider view.
She recognizes that it is going to be, I mean, it's already brutal. It is going to be absolutely brutal. And she wants to make sure that she's just completely, her husband didn't announce in 1992 until October of the year before. And so there is this kind of mentality of like, why do I have to go out there and stump so early? And so I don't think it has anything to do with being a woman. I think it has to do with the reality of whether you're a man or a woman. This is a grueling job. So you imagine that you're going to be on the grueling campaign trail for 18 months, and then you're going to have the most grueling job in the United States, which is to be the president of the United States if you win. And so I think she's being pretty realistic about, there is already a groundswell of her support out there for her in terms of Ready for Hillary and all of the work that's been going on. I think you will soon see her step into it, but I think it has literally to do with being as kind of, mentally and physically ready as she wants to be before getting out there.
So I don't have that kind of personal knowledge. What I will say, though, is I recommend highly this one-pager that Rich mentioned at the beginning of Laura Craig's research, because no matter what we think in this room about our lack of implicit biases, our very forward-looking gender, we don't make distinctions on the basis of gender, the reality is that there are very profound and deep sort of biases in the sense of different ways of viewing men and women doing the same thing. And I do think that will play into this campaign, as it did in when she was in the primaries before. And so I just advise you to take a look at this. This is about how women are perceived in terms of going after leadership? Is that overly ambitious? Is it appropriate? Is it things like that? The extent to which women are trusted when they take a position. The extent to which when women say something, they say something, and then all the evidence is it's not heard until the same point is made by the man in the room.
Yeah,
right.
We've both experienced that, I'm sure.
Right. So all of these things will play into this campaign. In addition to which, and I guess this is a question for you, Anne, what are the pros and cons, the dangers of using this agenda, which, so Hillary's agenda in her life has been very much on the kinds of issues we're talking about, children, and absolutely. But there might be a danger to making that the top of your policy agenda. What do you think about that?
Certainly that was the advice in 07 and 08, which is that, her advisors all around her said, you have to run as the senator who she'd been serving on the Armed Services Committee. You have to run as the senator from the Armed Services Committee, not as the woman who was the chair of the board of the Children's Defense Fund for years. And so we literally, people still don't know as much about her work on children because she didn't run on that last time. I think that she's now, because she's been Secretary of State, she's so well known in terms of her abilities. She's more able to run on that. Right. But you won't see her, this will be central, but it's she also needs to show that she's, playing in the big leagues, that she can go toe-to-toe on the economic questions that are, the broader macroeconomic policies. But I think she'll play a role like Janet Yellen is playing, which is to be, kind of in the room on really hard questions, but also being able to raise, as Janet Yellen did, questions about inequality, questions about early childhood development, tying that, however, to the business case for it, to the economic growth case of it. I think that's where we'll see it. Yeah.
Okay, I think we are on time and largely out of town. All right, if we have one more question standing up, let's go with that and we'll wrap up. Sure. No, I didn't see you. Let's do
no worries. So I think we're really lucky living in California that we have both disability and FMLA as far as, expanding families. What are we doing on the front of maternity leave and just in stating that, calling it what it is? Because there's so many other countries in the world that are ahead of us as far as the time that they give and the obligations that parents have, or getting better suited back into the workplace after going on disability, maternity leave, or FMLA. So what can we do as students, Americans, to better fight for maternity leave, just calling it what it is, and not disability and FMLA and all the things that go along with that?
Right. That's a good question. So, there's a big debate actually in the women's movement for years and years about kind of equality versus accommodation. And so we've, really made this very gender neutral and made it paid family leave, not maternity leave. The fact of the matter is that this does impact women more than it does impact men, because women, despite the Supreme Court's pregnant versus non-pregnant persons, women do actually get pregnant. So I do think it is important that we call it out. But I also think that the reason that the women in this country have wanted it to be gender neutral is because we want employers to look at women and men and feel like it's going to cost me the same amount to have that woman as that man, which is that man may take paid parental leave as well. So I actually think we're better off if we keep fighting for the gender neutral and we encourage men to take advantage of paid family leave. We're actually going to be better off for it.
I think my understanding, and I don't know exactly how they do it, is that in the Nordic countries, they've tried to really push much more onto equal use of the parental leave policy by having it much. Basically, this is the issue of the incentive for the parents to take the leave, and they're really working very hard on male taking advantage of parental leave. Right?
Exactly.
So that's, I think, the key thing here. You make it is about parents. And there's the issue of, you have to be in the room to give birth to the child. That's the time off from work because there's no other choice. But the parental leave is, I think, the solution. All right, well, this has been a fascinating conversation. Let's wish Anne the best of luck.
Thank you to Laura.